Today's podcast episode is a conversation with Bianca Blomquist, who is a California Policy Director and Northern California Outreach Director at Small Business Majority, which is a national small business organization that empowers America's diverse entrepreneurs to build a thriving and equitable economy. So thank you for coming on this podcast, Bianca.
Totally. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I think the most important statistic that I want to mention at the beginning is that small businesses represent 99.8% of all businesses in California and hire 7.4 million employees, right? So we can say confidently that there would be no California without small businesses. Do you agree?
100%.
Right. But in recent years, there has been an exodus of California businesses. Some study reports that the number of departing establishments nearly doubled from 2012 to 2019. Another study reports that there has been a population decline in California, citing there's a seemingly endless stream of firms leaving the state, citing high taxation, heavy regulation, other business costs, and anything but a business-friendly environment. So I want to spend the next, hour or so understanding the causes of the outflow of small businesses from California and what we can do to fix it. So what do you, Bianca, contribute the outflow of businesses from California? Is it high taxes? Is it regulation? Is it crime, homelessness? What is it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be helpful, first off, to have a better understanding of the types of businesses that are leaving and the size. I don't know if the size of the employers are included in that data. I haven't seen data that includes the size of small business.
Let's define a small business.
Small businesses leaving the state. So it depends on who you ask. If you ask me, a small business is certainly any business that has 100 employees or fewer. But I would also say predominantly when we're talking and working with small businesses, we're talking about those with less than 25 employees. In fact, our organization represents 85,000 small business owners nationwide and 20,000 here in California. The average size of our business has 4 employees.
Wow.
These are what we call micro businesses. And what micro businesses tend to have in common is that they lack dedicated HR departments. They probably don't have a lawyer on hand to run all of these, any questions by. So they're pretty much bootstrapping it. And most of these business owners didn't go into business to be an HR professional or a legal expert or a marketing expert, all of these things you need to run a business. They started their business because they're passionate about, making cakes or planning events or designing things online. And so a lot of these extra things that go into running a business can be really difficult for a small employer because they're not, they might not have that expertise readily available.
Correct.
And so when we're talking about who has left the state, again, it's tough to say. I can only speak to the small business perspective. I haven't talked to many very small businesses that are leaving California. I think, when it comes to small business sentiments, it really depends. Small businesses aren't just like a monolith, like a block, right? Every small business owner is very different, working in different ways with different business models, with different perspectives and life experiences that they're bringing to the table. But what small businesses have in common most often, the really small businesses especially, is that they care very, very much about their employees. Oftentimes they are hiring their neighbors, they're hiring their family members. Oftentimes they're hiring, they themselves are their own employee, and they want to ensure that they're creating a work environment that is a healthy and happy place to work. Not only because it contributes positively to your bottom line as an employer, but also because it's the right thing to do.
Mhm,
Most small employers want to do the right thing.
mhm.
So
And
that was
what
a long
type
way of
of
saying I'm not
business is,
sure.
yeah, no, it's a great answer. So what type of business is the most common one? As a small business, is it a franchise? Would you classify that as a small business?
That's tricky. Franchises have very specific business models,
Mhm.
and a large amount of constraints on what they do. They don't have the freedom to change their business model the way another small business would. So I would say that um, the small business owners are small business owners because they contend with small business issues,
Yeah.
but they're not independently owned and operated. So
Mhm.
that's the distinction there. What small business is the most prevalent? Um, it depends on the region. We have a huge state, right? There are definitely more small businesses in certain areas than there are in others, and I think there are a lot of other factors that might lead to that. But we have seen, and I think this is true for California and outside of California, there's
Mm.
been a sizable shift in the last 20 years to or 30 years, I should say, to a more services based industry,
Yeah.
and especially since the pandemic.
So you said you haven't seen a business that is unhappy with the California business environment and plans to leave the state. You haven't spoken to anyone like that?
I haven't spoken to anyone that's planning on leaving California. I have
Anyone who's left already?
no.
Wow.
I
Okay.
have talked to small business owners who've had to close their business
Hmm.
throughout the pandemic.
What was the cause of the closure?
Let's see. Um, One business was citing the difficulty in getting their commercial property insurance renewed. I think that their insurance was going from $24,000 a year to um twice that, pretty much,
Mm.
$49,000 a year, because they the regular insurance carriers were not going to renew their policy. And we've seen some large insurance carriers pull out of the state entirely. This
Why is
business,
that?
mostly due to climate change concerns. An insurance
Climate change
company is,
concerns?
yeah, an insurance company, they're not making money in California. If you think about the amount of wildfires that we have and the claims that go in, they've pulled out of other states that
Mm.
are experiencing natural disasters as well. Florida, a lot of folks there are having, and this also is
Yeah.
impacting the residential insurance place, but yeah, it's just not profitable for these insurance companies to cover folks in some of these states that are putting in a lot of claims for what is only the tip of the iceberg going to be the new normal when it comes to natural disasters.
Yeah.
That's just an example. But I have talked to small business owners who are unhappy. Absolutely. I think it's important when you're asking questions about, like, for example, use the regulatory environment as an example.
Yeah.
Which regulatory environment? Are we talking about local regulations? Oftentimes a lot of the issues that small businesses are coming up against, childcare providers and zoning, for example, that's a municipal issue. These are local regulations that you would need to go to your city council or your county board of supervisors, but who has the time to do that, especially as a small business owner? You're going to close your business for half of a day to go attend a city council meeting so that you can make public comment. That's just not doable for a lot of folks. And then there are state regulations, of course, and federal regulations as well. And so it's important to really understand which types of regulations are impacting small business owners and not to lump them all into one big issue.
Yeah. So if the issue is zoning laws, and what do you suggest that the businesses do? if they can't go to a town hall and speak with a council member, do they email them? Do they even get a reply? Is there any type of escalation?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to be someone who ever speaks against civic engagement. I think it's a privilege to be able to engage in that way, but I also think it's a responsibility of ours. That being said, it's just not reasonable to assume large amounts of small business owners or any working person is going to be able to engage in that at that level and be super effective all of the time. And so there's strength in numbers. I think, that's why many business organizations exist, chambers of commerce, but there are merchants associations. There are lots of groups. I'm blanking on the name. BNI committees, for example. There are other ways that small business owners can coalesce, get together, and leverage their strength in numbers to affect change. I have one small business owner in Fresno who started an association of climbing gyms in her region because they were being severely impacted by the pandemic COVID responses. If you remember, there were NACES codes, and California had a whole blueprint. And gyms were some of the most severely impacted just because the amount of probable COVID exposure there. And so she created a group so that when they did submit letters, they were able to have 15 signatures as opposed to one. That's an incredibly valuable method of engaging civically. And
And
people
was
do.
there any response from the, officials?
I'm not sure. I don't even remember who she was writing to. I'd have to check though. She's on our council. I'm sure she'd be very responsive. But I mean, governments respond in a number of different ways. Sometimes they don't respond.
And
And that,
sometimes it's the opposite. When you speak up and complain, you actually get harassed and bullied. I spoke with the restaurant owner actually a couple days ago, and he said he was speaking up against the increased licensing fees and water fees and whatnot, and the lack of response from the police when they had vandalization or robbery. And he was being bullied and harassed. And the next day, enforcement officials came up to him and, told him how he basically broke the law without, him doing anything differently for the past 30 years. So I feel a lot of business owners are scared to speak up and they're scared to complain at all. What do you say about that? What do you think about it?
about what?
The inability of businesses to speak up because they fear bullying
Oh,
by the government.
repercussions. Yeah. I mean, well, it sounds like what they were doing was retaliation for, it sounds almost, borderline illegal what was happening there. But it's there's a risk with everything that you do. And I think, if you're speaking up in a local government space, and they don't like what you have to say, you have to be prepared to hear their response. But I think any kind of like illegal retaliation like that is not okay, and that's something that shouldn't be dealt with. And I would imagine that most of the times when folks are engaging in a civic way, in a civil way, they're not that doesn't happen. But
So
I'm
it
sorry.
hasn't happened to any of your businesses.
Well, I haven't talked to all 20,000 small business owners in our
Yeah.
network. I do my best.
Yeah.
But no, I haven't heard of that kind of
Mm.
retaliation. But I'd be happy to ask our small business owner who created that association what her experiences
Mm-hmm.
have been like engaging in that way.
Mm-hmm. I'm surprised that out of the 20,000 businesses, there wasn't a single one who thought about leaving California because
Well, as I said, I haven't talked to all
well,
20,000.
but you must have statistics, no? Don't you do polls or any of these things, surveys?
We do polls, third party independent polling and research as
Mm-hmm.
well. But it's hard sometimes to do those on a statewide level. Oftentimes they're national. Um,
Mm.
We do most of our research is around issues that are larger priorities for small business owners in our network, which include predatory lending, affordable health care, their ability to offer benefits and have a workforce that is engaged and dedicated and talented. So those are more of the issues that we tend to focus on.
I'm glad you mentioned predatory lending. Again, I was speaking to a black female business owner who said that she was given increased rates on her loan because of her background and because of her ethnicity. So can you speak about this issue? How is this legal? What are you doing to fight it?
How is predatory lending legal?
Yes, and what are you doing to fight it? What are you doing for your small
Sure.
business owners to get equal treatment, fair treatment?
Yeah, I mean, well, this is a huge issue. So, first and foremost, there are no federal protections for small business owners against these types of lending products, right? The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that came out of the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Act after the financial crisis, when there were those predatory home loans being made, those protections were not extended for small business owners, which means it's up to each state to protect its own small business owners against those types of practices. So here in California, we have what's called the Department of Financial Protection and Innovation. And the kind of hallmark legislation that protects small business owners in California was passed in 2018. It was the nation's very first truth in lending legislation for small business owners. And it essentially requires that all commercial financing products must provide an APR. You know, when you open up a credit card envelope in the mail, you open it up and you see in big bold letters the APR associated. That doesn't exist for small business owners. And so how are they supposed to know how much these loans cost?
What? Seriously? So they sign up to something that they have no idea what the future cost is.
They have the ideas that are given to them, right? Well, it depends on how fast you pay it back. You can pay it back in 3 months, you could pay it back in 6 months, and it costs this. But really what we see is that on average, small business owners are taking out online loans at an average APR of 94%. And that is average. I have seen
94%. That's
300, 400% APR associated with these loans. And because of SB 1235, which was passed in 2018, lenders are still able to make those loans, but they have to disclose how much they cost. So at least a small business owner is able to make an informed decision. And this year, SB 33 continues to require that APR disclosure. So if SB 33 does not pass, which it will, but if it doesn't, then lenders are no longer required to disclose that APR to small business owners, which is going to be disastrous for small business owners of color, especially like the one you were talking about, because these are the small business owners that are least likely able to get a loan through your traditional financing establishment, Bank of America, your community bank even.
And how are you then supposed to compare these loans if you don't have an APR?
I mean,
how do you compare loans between different banks?
Lenders will say that they have their own calculations that they think are better than APR. But they think that they're better because they tend not to demonstrate exactly how expensive they are. And lenders will also tell you to read the fine print.
Wow. And do you provide any financial advice to these small businesses?
No. I do not provide that kind of technical assistance to small business owners. I leave that to the experts, the small business development centers, or other technical assistance providers, and then of course our amazing consortium of CDFIs throughout the state We have community lenders throughout the state that do disclose APR.
Mm-hmm.
And more than just disclosing APR, they provide that high touch support to a small business owner because they want the small business owner to be able to afford the loan, to pay it back, and eventually move up the economic ladder so that one day they will be eligible for a more traditional loan through your community bank or credit union.
What is the bill you mentioned that would make APR that would make banks disclose it?
SB 33.
SB 33. What do you think are the chances that this will pass?
I think the chances are good. I think that I think we've been working as well as we can. SB 1235 passing in 2018 provided a really strong framework for this bill. All this does is eliminate one provision to be able to allow that APR disclosure. But it's important to remain cautiously optimistic, especially when the folks on the other side have resources, a lot of resources to spend against lobbying against a bill.
Correct. Yeah, that's always the issue. Lobbyists are more powerful than trade associations or any type of business association. You also mentioned benefits, paid benefits. And with Dillet, this business owner that unfortunately couldn't make it to this episode, she said that she supports paid mental health leave for her employees. What is the general feedback of business owners in your network? Do most support it, or do they find it's too much of a burden for them? Because, if you have a highly skilled worker that leaves for 12 weeks, that will negatively impact your business. So how do you deal with it?
Yeah. Well, to answer your question, we did do a third-party independent poll, but this poll was of business owners, not necessarily within our network only. It was of small business owners throughout California. And they demonstrated varying degrees of support for a lot of these measures, including increasing the number of paid sick days in California from 3 days to 7 days per week. I was expecting that that the polling would come back positively based on my experiences talking with small business owners. I was surprised at how strong it was. I think it was like 85 or 88% demonstrated support for increasing those paid sick days. And we weren't able to ask why during the poll. But in my conversations with business owners, I realized it's mostly because they already do that, right? If you have a workforce of 4 people, regardless of how talented that worker is, if they're sick, especially right now, oh my gosh, with COVID and the regular flu and everything else, the last thing you want is them coming into the store and getting everyone else on staff sick. I mean, I have a friend of mine works at a larger corporation in San Jose, and she said her entire floor one week was out sick a few weeks ago. So that's the last thing that a small business owner wants.
Do you think there's a negative correlation between the size of the business and the support for these policies? So the larger the business is, the less supportive they are of the policies? Because I would imagine if you're a small business with 4 or 5 employees, they're all your friends, your family that you deeply care about. And so you're more supportive of those policies. As the business gets larger, you have less and less relationships with these employees. So you're perhaps,
that's definitely a theory. I've heard that discussed before. I mean, it's hard to know because if you ask some of these larger organizations that do represent businesses but are against the bill, they will say that their members care about their employees just as much as a small business would. But I mean, I do think that size is a consideration. Providing these extra paid sick days. For a small business, if that's a couple $100 a year,
Yeah.
that's one thing. But if you're a much larger business, we're talking a much larger number.
Yeah.
So I'm sure that the cost goes into consideration more with the larger businesses. Although small business owners are more acutely impacted by changes.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that because they're small, sometimes they have the flexibility to figure it out, whereas these larger corporations, it's much harder.
Can you also talk about the California's paid family leave policy, which I believe is 8 weeks, 8 paid weeks off? Is that correct for new
Yeah,
mothers?
so the California Paid Family Leave Program is part of state disability insurance.
Mm-hmm.
It's under the state disability insurance, and every state, not all states have a paid leave program.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if all states have a disability insurance program. I imagine most do, but
Yeah.
they're all set up very differently. And California's is different in that paid leave and state is paid entirely through worker contributions. So when you get your pay check and you see the line items of subtractions there, SDI is one of them. And that's because you pay for it as an employee. I pay for it as an employee. Employers don't contribute to that program. In some other states, though, employers do contribute to paid leave.
Mm-hmm. How about CFRA, the California Family Rights Act, which provides employees up to 12 weeks of unpaid job protected leave to care for their family member or if they have a serious health condition?
Yeah, and this is where it gets kind of confusing because, you have these programs that kind of layer on themselves.
Yeah.
So the paid family leave program does not provide job protection, but CFRA does.
Right.
So while CFRA is unpaid and paid leave is paid, CFRA protects your jobs. Because what's the point of it, having paid leave if you're just going to get fired?
Yeah.
And so that's the big difference between the two.
Well, I think I've read a few articles where a lot of businesses said they were negatively affected by CFRA, especially the ones who have workers that are very hard to replace, right? Do you have any feedback like that from your network?
Yeah. Actually, we sat on the governor's paid family leave task force to kind of hash out some of this stuff I think it was in 2018 or 2019. My colleague sat on that. So to talk about how can we make these programs more small business friendly?
Yeah.
Can we make these programs accessible to more California workers? And one of the recommendations that came out of that program was to create some kind of grant program that would be available for employers whose employees did have to take paid leave to give them some sort of cushion to either hire a new worker or, train another employee to do those tasks or, to cover the cost of you as the employer picking up that work. But that was something that we've heard, and that's something that all businesses deal with, right? If you're sick, if you're on paid leave, if you're on medical leave, if you're not at work, that creates somewhat of a vacuum for folks. But the alternative is to ask people to not take care of their family or their own health, which is long term, doesn't help small businesses at all. And there's data that demonstrates that those states that have these types of programs tend to see reduced turnover. The employees are happier, and in the long term, it helps the small businesses' bottom line.
Another topic that I wanted to discuss and that small business owners have complained to me about is the increased bureaucracy and the amount of time that they have to wait for, obtaining licenses, getting permissions to set up their headquarters, their factories, their manufacturing. In fact, one owner said, when his manufacturing company sought a height variance for its new headquarters, a Los Angeles planning official said, "Over my dead body." And then he moved to Oklahoma, where a planning official gave the manager building permits for an expansion before he even asked for them, right? So in Los Angeles, the planning officials kind of think their job is to say no and make it harder for small businesses to get things done, versus in other states, it's the opposite. They actually want you to move faster. They want you to set up your factory faster. So what can we do to remove these barriers, to allow small businesses, to sort of expedite these permission processes and applications?
Yeah. I don't have the best answer for you on how to eliminate bureaucracy within our local, state, and federal government.
Yeah.
I mean, if I had the answer to that, I would definitely not be working here. I would probably be running for president if I had that answer. But
yeah.
But it's tough. It really does depend. Especially throughout COVID, I found that, this is why I keep my personal cell phone number on my business cards and on our presentations on our website, if my IT director allows me to, is because small business owners oftentimes just want to talk to a person, right? You've spent all this time reading the rules, printing out these forms, going somewhere to get it printed, filling it out, only to have made a very small mistake and have the whole thing rejected because of that small mistake. So then you have to go back and do it all again. And this is why California invested $23 million of permanent funding for small business development centers, which exist in every county. And there's an SBDC that provides
23 billion or million?
23 million.
Million. Okay.
23 million in permanent funding for small business development centers for business advisors to help walk small business owners through a lot of this stuff. And they do that for free.
Do they have translation services?
They do. Actually, Access SBDC, which is one of my favorite small business development centers in San Jose, I did a presentation with them and they had live translators.
Wow.
I think it was like in 7 different languages. It was crazy, the prep, like that hour before the webinar starts and everyone's trying to figure out where to go. But that was incredible. Some have more services than others depending on where they're at, right, to attend to the needs of that specific population. But yeah, these small business development centers are a piece of that puzzle. There are also SCORE. I don't know if you're familiar with SCORE, as well as technical assistance, community-based organizations in each area. The issue, though, is that small business owners don't know that they exist.
Totally.
They don't know what an SBDC is, so they wouldn't know how to find one. They don't know SCORE. So that's a big issue. And that's where organizations like Small Business Majority come into play. Because that's why I was saying I leave that up to the experts. A big part of my job is just telling business owners that these resources are available.
That's a great point. I was at a farmer's market last week. I was speaking with a French bakery owner. They were making these delicious cakes and everything. And I asked them, what is the greatest barrier that you have come across setting a business in the United States? And they said, we don't know what to do. We don't have the support. We don't speak English very well. We don't know where to go. It's very difficult for us to obtain the information to make sure we have everything correct. So them having access to SBDC would definitely make the process easier for them, make it faster. Yeah. So I will send them the link now, since I know it exists.
Please. Yes. And your website, tell, your next podcast, Small Business Development Centers, they're really, really terrific resources.
Yeah, 100%. And then another thing I wanted to discuss are climate policies. I think it's double-edged sword because we both recognize the effects of climate change in California. I think the wildfires are getting worse, droughts, right? Water scarcity. But a lot of the policies that were passed by the legislature actually have the opposite effect. They harm small business owners and they do nothing to tackle climate change. One of those is the tracking policy, where farmers or truckers have to sell their perfectly working gasoline trucks at below market value to states like Nevada or Arizona or even countries like Mexico. and purchase these new electric trucks, which have very low mileage, which are very difficult to repair, apparently break very often, and whose repair has been monopolized by these large international corporations. So small repair shops go out of business because they can't repair these electric vehicles. Truckers have increased costs. Small business owners that own trucking companies, again, go bust, go bankrupt. So this policy, even though the intent, I am sure, was good, has a very negative effect on a lot of small business owners.
Yeah.
So what have you done any research on this, on these climate policies? What is the feedback from your network?
I haven't done a ton of research on climate related policies. However, I am aware of some of the clean emission vehicle issues that have come up.
Mm-hmm.
I was working with a small business owner in our network who did participate in did purchase a clean vehicle.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's like a clean dump truck. And or a hauling truck, haul services. But in any case, a large truck, and he purchased a clean vehicle, financed it, and was having a really hard time paying back the loans on this vehicle.
Yeah.
So he ended up having to sell that and then go back to his old, dirtier truck. And I agree. I think that the state needs to do everything that it can to ensure that small business owners are not left behind, these very needed real climate policies that need to take place. I think that that's very real.
100%. So another thing that I wanted to discuss is minimum wage. There's a lot of discussion around that. Increasing the minimum wage, in my opinion, may sound great, but many businesses have been negatively impacted. I spoke with the restaurant owner a few days ago who said his restaurant in West Hollywood is now in the red. I think they're in negative 120K since last year because he has to pay his part-time waiters $19.08 per hour, which is the highest minimum wage in all of the US, on top of providing paid time off, which is very rare for part-time workers like waiters, right? So what do you think about these policies that aim to help, waiters and part-time workers, but actually leads to a lot of businesses going bankrupt or moving out of California?
Totally. I mean, listen, I think you got to look at the whole picture. If the average small business is paying 94% APR on their financing, how are they expected to make these kinds of changes? If a small business owner went from paying $24,000 to $49,000 for their property insurance, how are they going to keep up with these types of measures? If a small business is paying out the door for healthcare because maybe they're a single mom and they need to access quality healthcare for themselves and their family, how are they going to be able to make these kinds of changes? I think it's a holistic picture, and the bottom line is that small business owners are not competing on a level playing field, right? They don't have the resources, they don't have access to take advantage of all of the tax loopholes that exist that are in existence for these larger businesses. The franchises. You mentioned that the West Hollywood business owner is a restaurant. I bet you they're having a much harder time than the CEO of McDonald's is in making money. Right. But that doesn't detract from, the issue of minimum wage, which I think, honestly, we've done polling on it. It's outdated, so I don't want to cite it, and also because I don't know it by heart because it's older.
Mm-hmm.
But when we worked on the minimum wage issue a number of years ago, we polled our network, and I do believe there was a majority that did support, but they were very concerned about their business's ability to compete. And that's why I bring it back to the whole picture, right? What else can we do to support small businesses? If you're spending as a small business owner 3 hours of your time filling out some form and then going to your local whatever just to have it be disregarded, I mean, that time is money. Yeah. I mean, that was 3 hours of very valuable time that you just wasted on something that you didn't even know how to do in the first place. And so I think that it's really a much bigger picture than just minimum wage.
So what would you do? Would you decrease it? Would you let the market's forces play, the role of setting minimum wage? Or
So are you asking my personal opinion on minimum wage?
yes, or small business majority? Do you have a stance on that?
Yeah, I mean, we're supportive of what our network supports, and our network has supported minimum wage in the past. I think
But do you have a number that you can tell me?
I can point you to the research. We have a research page where it was published, but I think again, it was before my time, and I started in 2018.
Mm-hmm.
So it might have been it's very old now. But no, I wouldn't disagree with you that folks are concerned about how they're going to keep up with these costs, but they're just as concerned about the healthcare issue. They're just as concerned about their ability to access a loan. They're just as concerned about their ability to take time off work because they haven't had a vacation in 3 years. Like
Yeah.
these are all very real issues for small businesses.
Yeah. Can you talk about the healthcare issue? I think I missed that.
Like, what is the healthcare issue for
Yeah.
small businesses? Oh,
Yeah.
sure. So of the employers that do offer health insurance in our network, 67% have said that they struggle to afford it. Right. So even if they are offering health care, they're struggling to afford it.
Mm.
The small business marketplace in California is very expensive. It's there are a number of ways that we're working on stabilizing the marketplace and making it more affordable. But the fact of the matter is that the small group marketplace is expensive. As a nonprofit organization, with only 25 employees, we participate in that marketplace as well. And it's difficult. You don't have the leverage that you do as a large employer to say, actually, you know what? If you don't make this change, I'm going to go elsewhere. If you say that as a small employer, they don't care. They're like, fine, you only have, 10 and 15, 25, 50 employees. It doesn't matter. So they don't have that leverage that exists for larger employers. So there's that on the individual.
So what is the solution? What is the solution to that?
Getting more people enrolled in healthcare is usually how it evens out, right? If you have more folks participating in a program, that's how taxes work. If you have more folks participating in a program, typically the cheaper it becomes. But if you don't have folks participating in the program, then the folks that are participating, tend to be more expensive, and then healthcare costs rise for all. So there are a number, and that's just the marketplace issue, right? Then you have the issue of healthcare costs being extremely expensive in the United States anyway.
Yeah.
And that opens up a whole other can of worms. But here in California, we just established the Office of Healthcare Affordability, another bureaucratic agency, I know, but oftentimes they serve a real purpose. And this agency is going to set cost targets, saying, Lucy, if you get an MRI and I get an MRI, they should roughly cost between X, Y, and Y, right? Mm-hmm. What we have right now is you get an MRI and I get an MRI, and the costs are totally, totally different for no reason. And so this office is going to kind of stabilize the marketplace by setting those targets and providing incentives for these for-profit companies and providers to, meet those targets.
Okay, so standardized prices of different treatments. Okay. Sounds good. So another issue is taxes. Like California has one of the largest tax rates in the nation. In terms of corporate tax rate, it's the 8th highest with 8.84% flat. The top marginal income tax rate is 13.3%. Super high. And I think many businesses are leaving California exactly for this reason to states like Texas or Florida, where there's 0% income tax. what's the feedback from businesses in your network on income tax and corporate tax rate?
I haven't asked. We haven't asked our network their feelings about taxes specifically, at least in the number of years that I've been here since 2018.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm happy to see, I do believe we engaged our network in 2017,
Mm-hmm.
but that was only around federal tax proposals, primarily the two President Trump tax cuts that occurred federally.
And so there was a concern around the tax cuts?
The TCJA tax cuts in 2017.
Wait, why would they complain about tax cuts?
Right, great question. Well, because some of the tax cuts are not necessarily tax cuts. And I wasn't here yet, so I can't speak to the details, but I know there were a number of kind of niche tax issues, pass-through entities, the Trump administration administered something called a QBI tax deduction. I mean, there was a whole bunch of changes that were pretty in the weeds, that folks had opinions on one way or the other. And one of the difficult things with some of the tax conversations is, unless you're an accountant, it's really difficult to be accurate in what you're asking, right? So like, it's hard. You don't know what you don't know. So if someone tells you, listen, this legislation is going to be bad for your business because it's going to cost X amount more every day for you to operate your business, you're going to be like, well, that sucks. Like, I'm not for that. But to actually dig into the details to figure out, well, actually, this doesn't impact me because I wasn't in business in this year and I didn't take this deduction and I'm this size. And again, access to that legal and administrative expertise is something a lot of small business owners don't have. So that can be really tricky, engaging with folks on this issue in an accurate way.
Yeah. Yeah. Have you read up on the FAST Act? I've seen an article in Cal Matters, which talks about this regulation that aims to regulate fast food companies, where they basically lose control over, hiring, setting minimum wage, workplace conditions, protection of workers. Again, what's the feedback from the business owners in your network on this FAST Act?
Great question. So we don't have this, obviously, as you know, applies to large fast food companies only in California. So this doesn't apply, as we talked about at the beginning of the podcast, to your traditional independently owned business.
No, I think it applies to small fast food companies.
There is a size for what size fast food, how many franchisees you have to have in the state for the legislation to apply. But you're right, and that the impacts will definitely go beyond large fast food retailers in the state. There are definitely competition issues. But as I said, we don't have a lot of franchisees in our network. So I wasn't able to get a lot of feedback, but I will tell you, I was able to get some feedback and no one was willing to go on the record about it.
Wow. That's crazy.
A lot of these fast food franchisees, so not corporate, not McDonald's Corporation, but the folks that operate these fast food locations.
Yeah.
No one was willing to go on the record about it for fear of, as you were talking about before, that retaliation on behalf of their corporate bosses, basically.
Yeah.
And another thing I've heard is that a lot of these independent or these franchisees don't have the independence to really run the business the way that they want. I was talking to one business owner in the South Bay. She told me that she was considering increasing the amount that she would pay a new employee because she was having a hard time hiring. And when the franchisor found out about it, they took away two separate catering contracts from her location,
Wow.
which really put her in an icky position, and was, in her opinion, in response to her attempt to, um, change how much she was paying her employees. And even the amount of meals and prices, a lot of these operators, the franchisees, don't have the flexibility of making those decisions. And the way the franchise model has worked so far, is really having these independent franchise. Have you ever worked at a franchise,
I have
like
not. No.
McDonald's or anything? Okay, well, if you have, if one who listens to this has, they'll
Hmm.
know that each location competes against every other location. You want to be the fastest, you want to sell the most French fries, you want to
Hmm.
sell the most Happy Meals, and whoever does has some kind of financial incentive. Well, the franchisee operator also has an incentive because their inability of making a lot of other decisions for their business, like paying their employees more or less or changing the food items,
Yeah.
the only thing that they can really control is the cost of labor, right? Overtime, making sure people take breaks, don't take breaks, how many people are on the floor, how many people are closing. Those are the real areas of control for these franchisees, which means there is a downward pressure on wages, right? Because it's how you
Yeah.
stay competitive. And so this bill, the Fast Recovery Act, which we did not take a position on at Small Business Majority, by the way, because we don't have that polling, because we don't have
Mhm.
those members. But this legislation is aiming to kind of level the playing field, for both the franchisees and franchisee workers, with the franchisors who currently have all of the power.
Hmm. So it's the labor unions that are pushing this, and obviously
Yeah, I
franchises,
do believe SEIU is the sponsor of the bill.
and of course franchises, McDonald's, Chipotle are fighting. Uh, wow, this is crazy. Um, and then last but not least, we have 3 minutes, but I wanted to discuss regulation still. There's regulations targeting tech companies. It's a basket of antitrust bills that's now making its way up in Congress, I believe, which would have a detrimental impact on California's technology sector as a whole and would negatively impact Latino business owners who increasingly rely on technology to meet their needs. Have you heard about this bill? It's the American Choice and Innovation Online Act.
Yeah, I'm not super familiar, especially when that one line caught my attention, that it would specifically negatively impact I'm curious. Can you
It
tell me a
says
little bit more about the bill?
it says it would result in separate rules for online marketplaces than those governing brick and mortar businesses, creating
Oh,
a
sure.
highly inequitable landscape for the many small businesses, especially African American Latino, which do have these brick and mortar businesses, right? Um, Already struggling, attempting to control cutting edge, incredibly innovative sector of our economy. Blah blah blah. Business owners understand the importance of ensuring a competitive playing field. Uh, but the 5 antitrust bills Congress is now considering will have a wide-reaching consequences throughout the Golden State. Yeah, it would basically stifle competition, make them. Yeah, I guess I have to read more on this.
It sounds like a press release that you're reading.
It hasn't been passed yet. It's still circling
Yeah.
in Congress. So,
Yeah, that's my colleague Awesta. She's all over our federal stuff.
mhm.
I work on all of our California stuff, but I can tell you, according to history,
Yeah,
the antitrust legislation tends to benefit the little guys, at the expense of the conglomerates.
yeah,
So I would be curious. It sounds also like, fintech might be what they're talking about when they're talking about a disproportionate impact on marginalized communities like Black and Latino businesses.
maybe.
I was talking about that 94% APR online rate.
Hmm.
Those are online loans. That's fintech, and that stands for financial technology.
Right. Yeah.
Fintech has exploded in the last, especially 10 years, especially since the financial crisis, right? Because a lot of community banks are closing down. Traditional financiers are getting more risk averse, right? These are real issues that fintech is trying to solve, and that's great. Innovation is great, right? Specifically for these communities. But if it's happening at the expense of a business owner's ability to compete or a business owner's ability to make choices. So, for example, non-compete agreements, right? They call them traps in California. There's traps legislation that'll be coming up in 2024 that I'm happy to chat a little bit about from what I know because it hasn't been introduced yet. But small business owners are against these kinds of anti-competitive non-compete agreements. They're not for consolidation in the marketplace. As we can see in healthcare, as we've already discussed, consolidation in the marketplace only leads to increased prices and less competition.
100%. Cool. Well, we ran out of time, but it was a pleasure chatting with. If there's anything else you want to talk about, please say it now.
This is my first time participating on this podcast, actually. I'm curious to know who you had last time and who you plan on having come for the next one.
God, this is a difficult question. I am actually traveling to San Diego on Thursday to speak with farmers. So I'll have 3 farmers on the podcast. I'll do little videos from their farm and gardens and nurseries. So I'm excited to do that.
Gosh.
Yeah.
There might be some farmers market legislation coming up in 2024. I know last year or a couple years ago, we passed legislation to allow folks to use their EBT funds at farmers markets, which is like, duh, right? But
what's EBT?
Basically like food stamps.
Okay.
Right. But to be able to use them at farmers markets where the most fresh produce and healthy foods, but also what a great benefit to the small farmers who, if we're talking about competition issues, are having a really hard time competing against ConAgra and Purdue.
100%.
Wonderful. Oh, I'm so excited to tune in.
If you have any more information on that, can you please send it over? I will make sure to cover it in the interview.
Absolutely.
Cool. Well, thanks so much, Bianca. It was a pleasure, and let's stay in touch. I'm really interested to know about, upcoming regulations, any policies that are going to affect small business owners. And hopefully we will be able to fix it.
Yeah, I agree. Well, we're here to support. I look forward to working with you.
Cool. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.